The evening of June 24th, 2026 began much like countless others across northern Venezuela. In Caracas, rush hour traffic was beginning to thin as workers made their way home. Along the Caribbean coast, fishing boats were returning to port after a day at sea. Restaurants prepared for the evening crowd, children played outside before sunset, and families settled into their daily routines. Nothing suggested that within minutes, one of the most unusual earthquake sequences ever recorded in the region was about to unfold. At 18 hours, 04 minutes and 33 seconds Venezuelan Standard Time, the ground suddenly began to shake. The earthquake originated approximately 23 kilometers, or about 14 miles, southeast of Yumare, east-northeast of San Felipe. Within seconds, powerful seismic waves spread across northern Venezuela, radiating outward from the rupture and reaching communities far beyond the epicenter. For people nearest the source, there was no warning. The first indication that something was wrong came from beneath their feet. Windows rattled violently, ceiling lights swung from side to side. Furniture shifted across floors as the ground lurched unexpectedly. In many buildings, the familiar sound of everyday life was replaced by cracking concrete, breaking glass, and the deep rumble of structures responding to forces far beyond their normal design. Instinct took over. People rushed toward doorways before quickly realizing that remaining inside was no longer safe. Streets rapidly filled with residents searching for open spaces away from buildings, utility poles, and falling debris. For many, the earthquake seemed to last far longer than it actually had. That perception is common during major earthquakes. Under intense stress, the human brain often loses its normal sense of time. A shaking event lasting only a few seconds may feel considerably longer, while a prolonged earthquake can seem almost endless. As the initial shock continued, emergency telephone lines began receiving their first calls. Reports described damaged buildings, fallen masonry, power outages, injured residents. Across northern Venezuela, emergency responders began mobilizing even before they understood the full scale of what had happened. Then, before the first earthquake had fully run its course, the Earth delivered another powerful blow. At 18 hours, 05 minutes, and 11 seconds, just 38 seconds after the first earthquake began, a second, even larger earthquake ruptured farther east along the same regional fault system. This one measured magnitude 7.5. For most people experiencing the event, there was no obvious break separating the two earthquakes. The violent shaking simply continued. Buildings already oscillating from the first rupture were suddenly forced to endure another intense burst of seismic energy. Cracks that had begun opening widened further. Walls that had already been weakened lost additional support. Structures that might have survived a shorter earthquake now faced nearly another minute of powerful ground motion. Together, the two earthquakes produced approximately 92 seconds of almost continuous shaking. That duration would prove to be one of the defining characteristics of the disaster. When engineers evaluate earthquake damage, they do not focus solely on magnitude. They also examine how long, strong shaking persisted. A building is much like a metal paperclip. If you bend it once, it usually springs back into shape. But bend it repeatedly. The metal begins to weaken. Eventually, it breaks. Buildings respond in a similar way. Every second of strong shaking forces beams, columns, joints, and foundations to absorb tremendous stress. If that stress continues through multiple cycles, structural components gradually lose strength. Connections loosen, cracks propagate, materials approach their failure limits. This is one reason why an earthquake lasting over a minute can be significantly more destructive than a shorter event of similar intensity. Duration matters. As darkness approached, the extent of the disaster gradually became clearer. Across the affected region, older masonry buildings suffered some of the most severe damage. Roads were blocked by debris. Portions of bridges required immediate inspection before traffic could safely resume. Hospitals activated emergency protocols as injured residents continued arriving throughout the evening. Communication also became increasingly difficult. Power interruptions affected some communities, while mobile phone networks quickly became congested as millions of people attempted to contact relatives and friends simultaneously. Long before comprehensive official reports became available, photographs and videos recorded by residents began revealing the scale of the destruction. Collapsed walls, dust-filled streets, damaged homes, communities gathering in parks and open areas, uncertain whether another major earthquake might follow. Meanwhile, the shaking was not confined to Venezuela alone. The earthquake was felt across much of the southern Caribbean, including neighbouring islands and portions of northern South America. Although the severity varied from place to place, the event reminded millions of people that tectonic forces beneath the Caribbean region are shared across national borders. As rescue operations continued through the night, scientists were already receiving their own flood of information. Seismic monitoring stations across the globe had automatically detected the earthquakes within minutes. Computers rapidly calculated preliminary locations, magnitudes and depths, while specialists began reviewing the incoming data. At first, the results appeared straightforward. But among seismologists, one detail immediately stood out. Not the magnitudes, not the depth, not even the location. It was the extraordinary timing. Major earthquakes do occasionally occur close together, but two earthquakes of this size beginning only 38 seconds apart along adjacent sections of the same fault system are exceptionally uncommon. Almost immediately, researchers recognized that this sequence deserved much closer examination. Had northern Venezuela simply experienced a rare earthquake doublet? Or had scientists just witnessed something even more unusual? At that moment, no one could answer. The priority remained saving lives, restoring essential services, and helping affected communities recover. The scientific investigation, however, was only beginning, and before researchers could explain what made this earthquake sequence so remarkable, they first had to answer a deceptively simple question. Did the Earth really produce two separate earthquakes, or had one enormous rupture merely changed its behaviour beneath the surface? On paper, it looked straightforward. Two earthquakes, two epicenters, two origin times, case closed. Except earthquakes do not always follow the neat categories humans assign to them. For seismologists, those first earthquake catalogues are not the final answer. They are the beginning of an investigation. As researchers reviewed the sequence, one question continued resurfacing. Why had another major earthquake occurred only 38 seconds after the first? Large earthquakes certainly produce aftershocks, sometimes thousands of them. But aftershocks are usually much smaller than the main earthquake because much of the accumulated tectonic stress has already been released. Here, the opposite had happened. The second earthquake was actually larger than the first. That immediately ruled out the simplest explanation. Instead, researchers began considering a much rarer possibility. Perhaps this was an earthquake doublet. An earthquake doublet occurs when two major earthquakes of comparable size happen close together in both time and location. Unlike the familiar main shock-aftershock sequence, neither earthquake clearly dominates the other. Each is powerful enough to be considered a major event on its own. Earthquake doublets are uncommon. Major earthquakes require enormous amounts of accumulated stress to occur in the first place. For two such events to happen almost back-to-back along the same fault system is unusual enough that every example attracts considerable scientific attention. Initially, the Venezuela sequence appeared to fit that description remarkably well. Yet the more scientists examined the timing, the less certain they became. 38 seconds may seem like a long time during an earthquake. In geology, it is almost nothing. A fault hundreds of kilometers long does not rupture instantaneously. Once movement begins, the fracture propagates through the crust, breaking one section after another as stored energy is released. That raised an intriguing possibility. What if the rupture had never actually stopped? Imagine unzipping a heavy winter jacket. At one point, the zipper catches briefly on a fold in the fabric. You pull a little harder. The zipper continues moving. Although there was a momentary hesitation, you would still describe the action as one continuous motion. Some researchers believe certain earthquakes may behave in a surprisingly similar way. Rather than stopping completely, the rupture may briefly slow as it encounters a stronger section of the fault. Once enough stress builds, it breaks through that barrier and continues propagating, releasing another large burst of seismic energy. From the surface, it may appear as though two earthquakes occurred. Deep underground, however, the fault may have experienced one evolving rupture. This process is known as a cascading rupture. Instead of remaining confined to a single fault segment, the rupture spreads into neighbouring sections, producing a sequence of large energy releases that remain physically connected. Over the past 2 decades, cascading ruptures have become one of the most active areas of earthquake research. Several major earthquakes around the world have shown that faults once thought to rupture independently can sometimes fail together, creating larger and more complex earthquakes than scientists had previously expected. The Venezuela sequence quickly became part of that discussion. Some preliminary rupture models suggested that the first earthquake may have propagated from the Boconó fault onto the San Sebastian fault, where the larger release of energy followed almost immediately. If that interpretation ultimately proves correct, the Earth may not have produced two completely separate ruptures at all. Instead, the first rupture may simply have opened the door for the second. It is an elegant hypothesis, but elegance alone is never enough in science. Other researchers urge caution. A second explanation remained entirely possible. Large earthquakes dramatically change the stress acting on nearby faults. In some cases, those stress changes are enough to trigger another earthquake almost immediately. Under that interpretation, the first earthquake truly ended before the second one began. The interval between them was extraordinarily short, but they would still represent two separate seismic events. At first glance, the difference may seem academic. After all, the ground still shook, buildings still collapsed, lives were still changed. But for earthquake science, the distinction is significant. If the Venezuela sequence represents a cascading rupture, it would provide another important example of how large faults can continue breaking across multiple connected segments. If it represents an exceptionally rare earthquake doublet instead, it would improve scientists' understanding of how rapidly one major earthquake can trigger another. Either conclusion would expand our knowledge of earthquake behavior. Interestingly, this is not the first time Venezuela has presented scientists with such a puzzle. The devastating 1812 Caracas earthquake has long been the subject of a similar debate. Historical accounts describe destructive shaking over a broad region, but because modern seismographs did not yet exist, researchers have never been able to determine with certainty whether the disaster resulted from one large rupture or multiple closely spaced earthquakes. More than 2 centuries later, scientists find themselves confronting a remarkably similar question, this time with vastly better technology. Unlike researchers studying the earthquake of 1812, today's scientists possess dense global seismic networks, satellite observations, and high-performance computers capable of reconstructing earthquakes in extraordinary detail. Even so, no instrument can directly observe a fault breaking several kilometers, or approximately 1.9 miles, beneath the Earth's surface. Everything must be inferred from the evidence the earthquake leaves behind. That is why the scientific debate continues. Not because researchers lack data, but because they possess so much of it. Every new seismic recording, every updated computer model, every satellite image, every field survey adds another piece to the puzzle. Some support the idea of 2 separate earthquakes. Others appear consistent with one cascading rupture. At present, neither interpretation has been definitively confirmed. Operational earthquake catalogues continue to classify the sequence as 2 earthquakes, while some preliminary scientific studies suggest the possibility of a single evolving rupture. It may take months or even years of peer-reviewed research before a broader scientific consensus emerges. Ironically, the answer may not lie in the earthquake catalogue at all. It may be hidden within the fault itself. To understand why the rupture behaved the way it did, scientists first needed to understand the geological forces that had been quietly building beneath northern Venezuela for centuries. Only then could they begin answering the question that had puzzled researchers from the very beginning. What transformed decades of silent tectonic motion into 92 unforgettable seconds? To understand why northern Venezuela experienced such a remarkable earthquake sequence, we must first understand the landscape beneath it. The Earth is not covered by one continuous shell of rock. Its outer layer, known as the lithosphere, is broken into enormous pieces called tectonic plates. These plates include entire continents and ocean basins, and although they appear motionless, they are constantly moving over the hotter, weaker rocks of the mantle below. The movement is incredibly slow. On average, tectonic plates travel only a few centimeters each year, roughly the same rate that human fingernails grow. That may seem insignificant, but geology is a science measured not in years, but in millions of years. Over immense spans of time, those tiny annual movements have built mountain ranges, opened oceans, and carried continents thousands of kilometers, or approximately hundreds to thousands of miles, from where they once existed. Northern Venezuela occupies one of the most active plate boundaries in the Caribbean region. To the north lies the Caribbean Plate. To the south lies the South American Plate. These 2 plates are slowly sliding past one another, and much of that movement is accommodated along a network of major faults crossing northern Venezuela. Among the most important are the Bocano Fault and the San Sebastian Fault. These faults act as enormous fractures within the Earth's crust, allowing the plates to gradually accommodate their relative motion. At least, that is what they would do if there were no friction. In reality, faults rarely slide smoothly. The rocks along either side of a fault are pressed together under enormous pressure generated by the weight of the overlying crust. Their rough surfaces lock against one another, much like two pieces of coarse sandpaper. Even though the tectonic plates continue trying to move, the fault refuses to slip. Imagine pushing a heavy wooden cabinet across a floor. At first, nothing happens. You push harder. Still nothing. The cabinet appears completely stationary. But your effort is not being wasted. Energy is building. Then, suddenly, the cabinet lurches forward all at once. The fault behaves in much the same way. For decades, or in some cases centuries, the plates continue moving while the fault remains locked. The surrounding rocks bend very slightly, storing enormous amounts of elastic energy. Geologists refer to this process as elastic strain accumulation. It is remarkably similar to stretching a rubber band. As long as the rubber band remains intact, it stores energy. Release it, and that energy is discharged almost instantly. The Earth's crust behaves in a comparable way. Except instead of rubber, the material is solid rock. Eventually, a critical threshold is reached. The accumulated stress exceeds the strength of the rocks holding the fault in place. The fault suddenly slips. An earthquake begins. This process is known as elastic rebound theory, one of the fundamental principles of modern seismology. First proposed after the great 1906 San Francisco earthquake, it remains the best explanation for how tectonic stress is stored and suddenly released during large earthquakes. On the evening of June 24th, that release began beneath northern Venezuela. Current rupture models indicate that the first failure occurred along a section of the Bocono Fault near Umare. But an earthquake is not like a light switch that turns on everywhere at once. It begins at a single point, known as the hypocenter, before rapidly spreading outward through the surrounding rock. Think again about tearing a long sheet of fabric. The tear starts at one small location. Once it begins, it races forward, breaking new material as it advances. The rupture within a fault behaves in much the same way. As one section fails, it transfers stress to the next. That section breaks as well. Then the next, and the next. The fracture propagates through the Earth's crust at speeds of several kilometers per second, or several miles per second, releasing enormous quantities of stored energy as it travels. This moving rupture is what generates the seismic waves that radiate outward in every direction. The larger the section of fault that ruptures, the more energy is released. According to current models, the initial magnitude 7.2 earthquake ruptured approximately 58 kilometers, or about 36 miles, of fault. The larger magnitude 7.5 rupture eventually extended across approximately 197 kilometers, or about 122 miles, along the San Sebastian Fault. Together, the earthquake sequence affected more than 250 kilometers, or roughly 158 miles, of one of Venezuela's principal tectonic fault systems. That enormous rupture length helps explain why the earthquake was felt across such a wide region. Yet distance alone does not tell the whole story. The direction of movement is equally important. The Venezuela earthquake sequence was dominated by right lateral strike-slip motion. To visualize this, imagine painting a straight line down the middle of a road. Now stand on one side and watch the opposite lane move steadily toward your right. That apparent sideways motion is the defining characteristic of a right lateral strike-slip fault. Rather than one side moving dramatically upward or downward, The two sides slide primarily past one another in opposite horizontal directions. Measurements indicate that some sections of the fault experienced as much as 2 meters, or approximately 6½ feet, of displacement. That may not sound particularly dramatic, considering the earthquake's size. But remember, this movement occurred along a fault extending for hundreds of kilometers or hundreds of miles beneath the Earth's surface. The amount of energy required to shift such an enormous volume of rock is almost beyond imagination. Another detail often goes unnoticed. When we see a fault drawn on a geological map, we are looking only at where that fracture intersects the Earth's surface. The fault itself extends many kilometers or many miles deeper into the crust. The San Sebastian Fault, for example, dips approximately 74 degrees toward the south. That means the rupture occurred along a steeply inclined fracture plane hidden far beneath the landscape, not simply along the narrow line visible at the surface. Understanding that three-dimensional geometry is essential because earthquakes are not surface events. The dramatic shaking people experience is only the final expression of a process unfolding deep underground. One aspect of the Venezuela earthquake particularly interested researchers. Updated rupture models suggest that the larger rupture extended all the way to, and perhaps slightly beyond, the coastline north of Caracas. That observation helps explain why Venezuela's capital experienced such destructive shaking, despite being located well east of where the sequence first began. The rupture itself had migrated toward the city. By now, scientists had developed a much clearer picture of how the fault broke. But another mystery was beginning to emerge. If the rupture propagated across hundreds of kilometers or hundreds of miles, why was the damage so uneven? Some communities experienced catastrophic destruction. Others, located at similar distances from the fault, suffered comparatively modest damage. Even within the same city, neighbouring buildings sometimes perform very differently during the earthquake. The answer, it turned out, was not hidden deep beneath the Earth's crust. It was hidden much closer to the surface. The ground beneath our feet can dramatically change how earthquake energy behaves. And uncovering that hidden influence would require scientists to investigate the earthquake in an entirely different way. If earthquakes happened in complete darkness, with no people to witness them, no buildings to damage, and no satellites watching from orbit, could scientists still determine exactly what happened? Surprisingly, the answer is yes. Every major earthquake leaves behind an extraordinary amount of evidence. Not visible evidence, invisible evidence. The moment a fault ruptures, it releases energy in the form of seismic waves that spread outward through the Earth in every direction. Those waves travel across continents, through mountain ranges, beneath oceans, and eventually reach thousands of sensitive instruments known as seismometers. Modern seismometers are remarkably precise. Many can detect ground motions smaller than the width of a human hair. Others record vibrations generated by distant storms, ocean waves crashing onto coastlines, or even the subtle background hum constantly produced by the planet itself. When a major earthquake occurs, they become the Earth's witnesses. Each instrument records a unique version of the same event. No two recordings are exactly alike because every seismic wave follows a different path through the Earth's interior before reaching a particular station. To an untrained eye, the data appear as a series of jagged lines. To a seismologist, those lines tell a story. The first waves to arrive are known as primary waves, or P waves. These are compressional waves that alternately squeeze and stretch the rocks they pass through, much like pushing and pulling on a long spring. Because they travel the fastest, P waves provide the first indication that an earthquake has occurred. They are followed by secondary waves, or S waves. Unlike P waves, S waves move the ground from side to side or up and down, producing stronger shaking than the initial arrival. Because they travel more slowly, the time difference between the arrival of P waves and S waves allows scientists to estimate how far each recording station is from the earthquake. By comparing those arrival times from dozens, or often hundreds of stations, researchers can determine where the rupture began with remarkable accuracy. That process identifies the earthquake's starting point, but it does not reveal how the rupture evolved afterward. To answer that question, scientists must look beyond the first arrivals and analyze the entire seismic record. Imagine hearing an orchestra from another room. Without seeing the musicians, you could still identify when the drums begin, when the violins join in, and when the brass section reaches its crescendo. An experienced listener can reconstruct much of the performance simply by analyzing the sound. Seismologists perform a remarkably similar task. Instead of musical instruments, they analyze waves generated by different parts of the fault as it ruptures. Each section of the fault contributes its own signature to the overall recording. By combining thousands of those observations, researchers use advanced computational techniques known as waveform inversion to reconstruct how the earthquake unfolded through time. Rather than producing a single point on a map, waveform inversion generates a moving picture of the rupture. It estimates where slip occurred, how much the fault moved, how quickly the rupture propagated, and where the largest releases of energy took place. For the Venezuela earthquake sequence, those reconstructions revealed something immediately intriguing. The rupture was not uniform. Some portions of the fault released relatively modest amounts of energy. Others experienced much larger displacements. Instead of one smooth failure racing along the fault, the rupture appeared to evolve through multiple phases. That observation is one reason some researchers began exploring whether the sequence represented a single cascading rupture with two major energy release episodes, rather than two entirely independent earthquakes. But seismic waves are only one source of evidence. Today, scientists can also measure how the Earth's surface moved during an earthquake without setting foot in the disaster zone. One of the most powerful tools for doing this is the Global Positioning System, or GPS. Permanent GPS stations continuously monitor their positions with extraordinary precision. When a major earthquake occurs, those stations may suddenly shift by several centimeters or even several meters in just a few seconds. By comparing their positions before and after the earthquake, researchers can determine how the crust deformed across an entire region. Yet even GPS stations have limitations. They provide exceptionally accurate measurements, but only where instruments have already been installed. Large areas between those stations remain unmeasured. To fill those gaps, scientists increasingly rely on satellites. One technique, known as interferometric synthetic aperture radar, or INSAR, has transformed earthquake research over the past 3 decades. Radar satellites repeatedly image the same landscape from orbit. When scientists compare images taken before and after an earthquake, they can detect changes in the distance between the satellite and the ground with astonishing precision, sometimes measuring movements of only a few centimeters or about 1 to 2 inches across hundreds of kilometers or hundreds of miles. The results often appear as colourful bands wrapped across the landscape. Although visually striking, those patterns are far more than images. Each band represents a specific amount of ground displacement. Together, they create a detailed map showing how the Earth's surface shifted during the earthquake. For the Venezuela sequence, satellite observations help confirm that crustal deformation extended across a broad region, providing an independent dataset that researchers could compare with their seismic models. When seismic waves, GPS measurements, and satellite observations all point towards similar patterns, confidence in the interpretation increases. When they disagree, the investigation becomes even more interesting. That is precisely why different research groups occasionally produce different rupture models after major earthquakes. Each team may use different mathematical assumptions, different combinations of seismic and geodetic data, or different methods of representing the fault itself. Those differences do not necessarily mean one model is correct and another is wrong. Instead, they reflect the complexity of reconstructing an event that unfolded kilometers or miles beneath the Earth's surface in little more than a minute. Over time, as additional data become available and methods improve, those models are refined. The picture gradually becomes sharper. The Venezuela earthquake continues to follow that process. Researchers around the world are comparing independent solutions, testing competing hypotheses, and searching for the model that best explains every available observation. That careful process may eventually determine whether the event is best described as two closely linked earthquakes or one continuous rupture with two principal bursts of energy. Yet, while scientists were refining their computer models, people living along parts of the southern Caribbean coastline were discovering evidence that no computer had predicted. The sea itself appeared to have moved. Boats rested where water had once been. Sections of the seabed lay exposed to the air. And an entirely new mystery was beginning to emerge. Had the earthquake permanently changed the coastline itself? When earthquakes reshape the landscape, the changes are not always immediately obvious. A mountain does not suddenly appear. A valley does not instantly vanish. More often, the transformation is subtle, a road that no longer lines up quite the way it once did, a stream that changes course, or a cliff that has shifted by only a few centimeters or a few inches. But occasionally, an earthquake alters the landscape so dramatically that the evidence is impossible to ignore. That is exactly what residents along portions of the southern Caribbean coastline began discovering in the days following the Venezuela earthquake sequence. As the shaking subsided and people cautiously returned to the shoreline, familiar landmarks no longer looked the same. In places where the sea had once covered the coast, broad stretches of seabed were now exposed. Boats that had previously floated in shallow water rested awkwardly on the newly elevated ground. Rocky reefs that had always remained below the surface could suddenly be walked upon. For coastal communities that knew every inlet, sandbar and tidal channel, there was little doubt that something extraordinary had happened. The shoreline itself had changed. The discovery quickly attracted the attention of geologists. When coastlines rise following a major earthquake, they provide something exceptionally valuable, a permanent geological record. Unlike the shaking, which lasts only seconds or minutes, vertical changes to the landscape can remain visible for decades, centuries, or even thousands of years. Ancient uplifted shorelines, preserved around the world, allow scientists to reconstruct earthquakes that occurred long before written history. Now, researchers had an opportunity to study a modern example almost as soon as it happened. The changes extended well beyond the water's edge. Residents described newly exposed seabed scattered with marine life that had become stranded as the coastline shifted upward. Dead fish lay across tidal flats. Crabs and clams were left exposed above the receding waterline. Even stingrays, animals normally hidden beneath shallow coastal sediments, were found stranded on portions of the newly emerged seabed. The scene illustrated just how rapidly the landscape had changed. Marine organisms adapted to life underwater had not gradually been left behind by changing tides. Instead, the ground beneath them had risen faster than the sea could return. Other observations proved equally intriguing. Fresh fractures crossed sections of the beach that had appeared undisturbed only days earlier. Small landslides scarred nearby slopes. In several locations, residents reported bubbling pools where gases appeared to be escaping through water-saturated sediments. Natural oil seepage also became more visible in some areas, suggesting that the earthquake had opened new pathways through the shallow subsurface or reactivated existing ones. None of these observations, taken individually, would necessarily indicate significant crustal uplift. Together, however, they painted the picture of a landscape that had undergone a sudden and profound geological adjustment. Among the scientists who visited the affected coastline was Trinidad and Tobago geologist Xavier Moonen. After examining the area, Moonen proposed one possible explanation for what residents were observing. Rather than interpreting the uplift as the result of a single block of crust rising uniformly, he suggested that parts of the coastline may have been affected by what geologists call a toe thrust, associated with a reactivated submarine slump. Although the terminology sounds highly technical, the basic concept is surprisingly intuitive. Imagine pushing on the back of a thick carpet lying across a polished floor. As the carpet bunches together, the leading edge begins to fold upward. The material at the front is forced higher, even though most of the movement originates farther behind it. A similar process can occur beneath coastal sediments. Over thousands of years, rivers deliver enormous quantities of sand, mud, and gravel to the continental margin. These water-saturated sediments gradually accumulate on underwater slopes. Under normal conditions, they remain relatively stable. During a powerful earthquake, however, intense shaking can destabilize those deposits. If the sediments begin moving downslope, the material at the leading edge may become compressed, forcing portions of the beach or shallow seabed upward. This process is known as a toe thrust because uplift occurs near the toe, or front, of the moving sediment mass. If Moonen's interpretation proves correct, it would help explain why some areas experience much greater vertical movement than neighbouring sections of coastline. Instead of the entire region rising by the same amount, localized geological conditions may have concentrated the uplift into specific areas. It is an intriguing hypothesis, but like many scientific ideas proposed soon after a major earthquake, it remains one interpretation among several. Researchers continue analyzing satellite measurements, field observations, marine surveys, and geophysical data to determine exactly how the coastline responded to the earthquake sequence. One of the most widely discussed observations concerns the amount of uplift itself. Local geologists have reported that portions of Trinidad's Galfa coastline may have risen by as much as 6 meters, or nearly 20 feet, following the Venezuela seismic sequence. If future investigations confirm that estimate, It would represent one of the most remarkable localized coastal uplifts documented in association with this event. At present, however, the reported uplift has not yet been independently confirmed by national or international geological agencies. As with the debate over whether the earthquake represented one continuous rupture or two closely spaced events, additional field measurements and peer-reviewed studies will be required before a scientific consensus can be reached. Whether the final measurement proves to be 6 meters or nearly 20 feet, or something smaller, one conclusion is already beyond dispute. The coastline changed permanently. The earthquake left behind a new geological landscape. Yet the Venezuela earthquake presents an additional puzzle. Most of the movement along the San Sebastian fault was right lateral strike slip, a type of fault motion usually associated with horizontal displacement. If the fault primarily moved sideways, how did parts of the coastline rise vertically? At first glance, the two observations appear almost contradictory. But beneath the Earth's surface, faults are rarely as simple as the straight lines drawn on geological maps. To understand why the landscape moved upward, we must first understand that faults move in 3 dimensions. Geological maps often portray faults as thin, perfectly straight lines crossing the Earth's surface. Reality is far more complicated. A fault is not simply a crack. It is a 3-dimensional fracture zone extending many kilometers or many miles beneath the ground, twisting, bending, changing direction, and varying in angle as it cuts through different rock formations. Those subtle variations can dramatically change how an earthquake deforms the landscape. Imagine driving along a perfectly straight highway. Traffic flows smoothly because every vehicle moves in the same direction. Now imagine the highway suddenly narrowing or bending sharply. Cars begin crowding together. Pressure builds. Movement becomes more complicated. Something similar can happen along strike-slip faults. Although the plates are trying to slide past one another, the fault itself is rarely perfectly straight. Small bends and irregularities create localized zones where rocks are squeezed together instead of simply sliding sideways. Geologists refer to one of these features as a restraining bend. A restraining bend forms where the geometry of a strike-slip fault forces opposing blocks of crust to compress as they attempt to move past each other. Instead of allowing purely horizontal motion, the rocks begin pushing upward as well. The result is known as transpression, a combination of horizontal shearing and compression. This process explains why mountain ranges can develop along faults that are otherwise dominated by sideways movement. The Earth's crust is responding to more than one force at the same time. The Venezuela earthquake offers a valuable reminder of that principle. Although the dominant motion was right lateral strike slip, the fault system is not perfectly linear. Variations in its geometry, together with differences in the surrounding geology, mean that some locations experience small but important vertical components of motion in addition to the much larger horizontal displacement. Earthquakes rarely behave in only one dimension. Another concept helps explain this complexity. Geologists often distinguish between the movement of the fault itself and the deformation of the surrounding crust. These are related, but they are not identical. Consider placing both hands on opposite sides of a thick book. If you slide the covers past one another, the pages inside do not all move in exactly the same way. Some bend, some wrinkle. Others compress or stretch depending on their position. The Earth's crust behaves similarly. As the fault slips, the surrounding rocks absorb part of that motion. Some areas are pulled apart, others are compressed, still others are lifted or lowered by subtle changes in stress. That is why earthquakes often produce surprisingly complex patterns of ground deformation extending well beyond the fault itself. The reported uplift observed along parts of the coastline may represent one expression of that broader crustal adjustment. Researchers continue evaluating several mechanisms. Some involve localized compression associated with bends in the fault. Others consider deformation caused by the geometry of the rupture at depth. Field observations have also prompted discussion of sedimentary processes, including the toe thrust mechanism proposed by geologist Xavier Moonen, in which earthquake shaking may have reactivated water-saturated coastal sediments and forced portions of the beach and shallow seabed upward. These explanations are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Large earthquakes often involve several geological processes operating simultaneously. That is one reason interpreting post-earthquake landscapes can be so challenging. Every new field measurement must be considered alongside seismic data, satellite observations, and the known structure of the fault system. There is another important detail that is easy to overlook. The 2 meters, or approximately 6½ feet, of maximum fault slip estimated in current rupture models does not automatically translate into 2 meters, or approximately 6½ feet, of movement at the Earth's surface. Those values describe displacement along the fault plane itself. Because the San Sebastian fault dips steeply into the crust at roughly 74 degrees toward the south, the movement occurring deep underground is distributed through many layers of rock before reaching the surface. Some locations experience more deformation, others experience less. Some areas may rise. Nearby areas may remain almost unchanged. The landscape responds to the earthquake as a connected system rather than as a rigid block. This complexity also helps explain why neighbouring communities sometimes report dramatically different levels of damage despite being located similar distances from the fault. The fault determines where energy is released, but local geology determines how that energy is expressed. Hard, crystalline bedrock tends to transmit seismic waves efficiently, often limiting the amplification of ground motion. Soft sediments behave very differently. When earthquake waves enter loose, water-saturated deposits, they slow down. As their speed decreases, their amplitudes often increase. The ground begins shaking more intensely. This phenomenon is known as site amplification. It has played a significant role in many of history's most destructive earthquakes. Large portions of Caracas are built upon an alluvial basin composed of relatively soft sediments deposited over thousands of years by rivers flowing from the surrounding mountains. During the Venezuela earthquake sequence, those sediments likely amplified seismic waves compared with nearby areas underlain by more competent bedrock. That amplification helps explain why some parts of the capital experience stronger shaking than might be expected based solely on their distance from the rupture. Intense shaking can also trigger another geological hazard. When loose, water-saturated sediments are subjected to prolonged earthquake motion, the spaces between sediment grains may temporarily fill with increased water pressure until the particles lose contact with one another. The ground begins behaving less like solid earth and more like a fluid. This process is known as liquefaction. Following the earthquake, photographs from several affected areas showed buildings that had settled unevenly, with one side sinking noticeably farther than the other. Such damage is often consistent with localized liquefaction, although similar structural failures can also result from severe shaking alone. Only detailed field investigations can distinguish between those possibilities. For that reason, scientists believe liquefaction likely contributed to some damage, but does not explain the majority of structural failures observed across the region. When all of these processes are considered together, fault geometry, crustal deformation, sediment behavior, site amplification and liquefaction, a clearer picture begins to emerge. An earthquake is never the product of a single geological mechanism. It is the combined expression of countless interactions occurring beneath the surface, many of them invisible until the shaking has already ended. That complexity is precisely why researchers continue studying the Venezuela earthquake with such interest. Each new observation reveals another layer of the story. And sometimes, those new observations even force scientists to reconsider conclusions they reached only days earlier. The earthquake itself may have lasted just 92 seconds. Understanding everything that happened during those 92 seconds could take years.